The trunk lid slammed shut before the last gown was even folded properly, and Cordelia Ashworth did not care. Her hands moved fast, faster than they had moved in years, as if her body understood what her mind had only just decided. 5 years of silence had ended in one single morning, and she was not going to spend another night in this house pretending otherwise. Outside her window, the gardens of Harrogate stretched in perfect green rows, trimmed by men who were paid more attention than she was. She had once loved that view. Now it only reminded her of every breakfast she had eaten alone, every dinner where the chair across from her sat empty while her husband worked late in his study, every evening she had waited by the door for a man who never came home in time to notice she was waiting. She pulled open the drawer of her writing desk and drew out a letter, already sealed, already addressed to her brother in Bath. Her fingers did not shake. That surprised her most of all. She had expected tears, some final flood of grief before she left the life she had built, or tried to build, inside these cold stone walls. Instead, she felt only a strange, clean calm, the kind that comes after a decision has finally been made, and there is nothing left to decide. A soft knock interrupted her. She did not turn from the trunk. "Come in." Mr. Pruitt, the estate steward, stepped inside with his usual careful posture, the posture of a man who had spent 30 years learning exactly how much space to take up in a room that was not his. His eyes moved from the half-packed trunk, to the sealed letter, to the calm set of her jaw, and something in his expression shifted, though he said nothing about it directly. "The Morning Post has arrived, Your Grace. Shall I have it brought up? You may send it to His Grace's study." "I have no need of it." Pruitt hesitated. In 30 years of service, he had never once heard the Duchess speak in a tone so final. He had watched her arrive at Harrogate as a bride of 19, hopeful and bright, eager to learn the names of every servant in the house within her first month. He had watched that brightness fade, slowly, the way a fire fades when no one bothers to add wood, until what remained was only ash, carefully arranged to look like warmth. "Is there anything you require, Your Grace?" "Only privacy, Mr. Pruitt, thank you." He bowed and left, but he did not go far. He stood in the corridor outside her door for a long moment, turning over what he had seen, before making his way toward the housekeeper's parlor to find Mrs. Whitlow, the only person in the house who might know what to do with what he had just witnessed. Cordelia returned to her trunk. She folded her mother's shawl, the one piece of home she had brought with her when she married into a family that never quite let her feel like family. She placed it on top of the gowns, careful not to crush the fabric, and closed the lid a second time, this time gently. She thought of the day she arrived at Harrogate. Nathaniel had met her carriage himself, which she had taken, at the time, as a mark of affection. He had helped her down with a steady hand and a formal smile, and she had spent the entire first month convinced that formality was simply his nature, something she would learn to soften with patience and time. She had been wrong. Patience had not softened him. Time had only hardened the distance between them until it became a wall neither of them bothered to climb. She remembered her own attempts in the early years to reach him. An invitation to walk the gardens together, which he declined, citing correspondence that could not wait. A letter she had written him about her father's failing health, hoping for comfort, which he answered a full week later with 3 brief lines about hoping for the best. A birthday she had quietly marked alone in her chamber, with a small cake sent up by the kitchen out of pity rather than celebration, while her husband remained in London on business he never bothered to explain. She had stopped counting the slights after the 2nd year. Counting them only made the ache sharper, and she had grown tired of sharpening a blade she never intended to use against him. She had simply gone quiet instead, the way water goes still before it freezes, and she had told herself that stillness was a kind of peace. It was not peace. It had never been peace. It had only been waiting, though she had not admitted that to herself until this morning, when she woke before dawn with a clarity so complete it felt like being born again. She did not need him to notice her leaving. She needed only to leave. A soft rustle came from the hallway, followed by hushed voices she recognized as Mrs. Whitlow and Pruitt speaking in low, urgent tones. She did not strain to hear them. Whatever they said would not change what she had already decided. She had spent 5 years arranging her life around the comfort of others, softening her disappointments so no one else would have to feel them, and she found she no longer had the strength for it. She crossed to her writing desk once more and opened a second drawer, this one containing a small wooden box that held what little jewelry she called truly her own, pieces from her mother rather than gifts from the Ashworth family vault. She set the box atop the trunk, not bothering to lock it, because she trusted no one in this house enough to think it needed hiding, and no one in this house had ever cared enough to steal from her either. Footsteps approached in the corridor, heavier than Pruitt's, faster than Mrs. Whitlow's careful shuffle. Cordelia recognized the rhythm instantly, the particular weight of a man used to command, a man who rarely hurried for anything, and her chest tightened despite her resolve. She turned toward the door just as it opened without a knock, which told her everything about the state he must be in, because Nathaniel never entered a room without announcing himself first. Formality was the one thing he had never abandoned with her. He stood in the doorway, still dressed in his traveling coat, dust from the London road still clinging to his boots. His eyes went first to her face, then past her, to the trunk sitting closed and ready on the floor, then to the small wooden box resting on top of it. For a long moment he said nothing at all. She watched something cross his features that she had not seen in years, something that looked almost like fear, though she told herself she must be mistaken, because fear required caring, and caring required attention, and he had given her neither in longer than she cared to remember. Cordelia. Her name came out rougher than he intended, she could tell, because he cleared his throat immediately after saying it. What is this? She kept her voice even. I would think it is fairly clear, Your Grace. Do not call me that. The words came sharp, almost pleading, and she blinked in surprise, because he had never once objected to the title before, had in fact seemed to prefer the distance it created between them. Tell me what is happening. Why is your trunk packed? Because I am leaving, she said it plainly, without cruelty, the way one might state the weather or the hour of the day. I have written to my brother. I will stay with him in Bath until I decide what comes next. You cannot simply leave. He stepped further into the room, and she noticed, almost against her will, that his hands were not steady, that he gripped the doorframe as if it might hold him upright. You are my wife. I have been your wife for 5 years, Nathaniel. His given name felt strange in her mouth after so long addressing him formally, but she found she no longer cared for formality either. In that time you have dined with me perhaps 30 times. You forgot my last 2 birthdays entirely. When my father was dying, you answered my letter after a week, as though my grief could wait for a convenient hour in your schedule. I do not say this to wound you. I say it because it is simply true, and I am tired of pretending otherwise. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, as though every response he considered collapsed before he could speak it. She watched him search for something, some argument or explanation, and watched him fail to find one, because there was nothing to find. She had not exaggerated. If anything, she had been generous in her accounting, leaving out the smaller wounds that had accumulated over years, until they built a wall too tall to see over. I did not realize, he said finally, and his voice had lost its usual command, had gone quiet in a way she had never heard from him. I did not realize it had become this. You did not realize because you were not looking. She picked up the wooden box from atop her trunk and held it against her chest, a small, instinctive gesture of protection. I stopped expecting you to look years ago. That is not an accusation, Nathaniel. It is simply what happened between us, slowly, until neither of us noticed the distance had become a country of its own. He crossed the room in 3 strides and stopped just short of reaching for her, his hand hovering in the air between them before he let it fall back to his side, as though he understood, even now, that he had lost the right to touch her without asking. Up close she could see the exhaustion in his face, the fine lines at the corners of his eyes that had not been there when they married, and for one unguarded moment she felt something soften in her chest before she forced it still again. She could not afford softness now. Softness was what had kept her here for 5 years, hoping, waiting, forgiving without ever being asked to forgive. Do not go, he said, and the words came out low, almost broken. Please, Cordelia, give me a chance to understand what I have done. She looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for the coldness she had grown so used to, and found instead something raw and unfamiliar, something that looked almost like a man realizing, too late, exactly what he stood to lose. It did not change her answer, not yet. But for the first time in years, she found she was not entirely certain of her own resolve, and that uncertainty frightened her more than his sudden panic ever could. I have already sent the letter, she said quietly. My brother expects me within the fortnight. Then let me at least understand why, before you go. His voice steadied slightly, though his eyes remained fixed on hers with an intensity she did not recognize. I owe you that much. I owe you far more than that, but let this be a beginning. Cordelia set the wooden box back down on the trunk, slowly, and folded her hands in front of her, unsure herself whether she was agreeing to stay or simply agreeing to be heard one final time before she left. Behind her husband, through the open door, she could see Mrs. Whitlow hovering in the corridor, her face pale with worry, and beyond her, Pruitt standing very still, watching the scene unfold with the quiet dread of a man who suspected the house he had served for 30 years was about to change forever, one way or another. Nathaniel had not slept. He sat in his study long after the household had gone dark, staring at a stack of correspondence he could not bring himself to open, his mind circling the same image over and over, his wife's hands folding silk into a trunk with the calm efficiency of a woman who had already left him in every way that mattered, long before her body followed. He had returned from London expecting the usual quiet of Harrogate, the same quiet he had grown so accustomed to that he no longer noticed it as absence. He had not expected to find that quiet had a shape, and that shape was Cordelia, methodically dismantling the only life he had ever known. At dawn, he summoned Mrs. Whitlow to his study. She arrived, still tying her apron, clearly startled by the early hour, and stood before his desk with the careful stillness of a woman who had served the family long enough to know when a question was truly a question, and when it was a trap. "Tell me the truth," he said, before she could offer a greeting. "How long has Her Grace been unhappy in this house?" Mrs. Whitlow's eyes flickered, just once, toward the window, as though searching the gardens for the right words. "Your Grace, it is not my place to speak on such matters. I am asking you to speak on them regardless. I will not repeat what you tell me, and I will not hold it against you. I simply need to understand what I have missed." She was quiet for a long moment, weighing loyalty against honesty, before she finally exhaled and folded her hands in front of her apron. "Since nearly the beginning, Your Grace. The Duchess arrived here full of hope. She learned every servant's name within her first month, remembered our children's birthdays, asked after our families as though we mattered to her as people and not simply as staff. She tried, in those early years, to bring warmth into this house. I believe she hoped you might meet her halfway, and I did not. You were often occupied, Your Grace, with the estate, with Parliament, with matters that required your attention. I do not say this to accuse you. I say it because the Duchess never once complained to any of us. She simply grew quieter, year after year, until the quiet became who she was, rather than something she wore for our benefit." Nathaniel pressed his palms against his eyes, willing away the tightness building behind them. "Why did no one tell me?" "Because it was not our place, Your Grace, and because we did not believe you would welcome the telling." Mrs. Whitlow's voice remained gentle, but there was steel beneath it, the steel of a woman who had watched something painful unfold for years, and finally found permission to name it. "Forgive me for saying so plainly, but you were not a man who invited such conversations." He said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not sound like an excuse, and he was done offering excuses, even to himself. He dismissed her with a quiet thanks and sat alone in his study until the sun rose fully over the gardens, turning the memory of the past 5 years over in his mind like a man searching a dark room for something he had dropped and forgotten. He thought of the walk in the gardens she had once invited him to take, early in their marriage, when her hope for him had still been bright and unguarded. He had declined, citing letters that needed answering, letters he could no longer even remember the contents of. He thought of the illness of her father, and the letter she had sent him in grief, and how he had set it aside for a week beneath other papers that felt more urgent at the time, though he could not now recall a single one of them. He thought of her birthdays, forgotten not once but twice, and felt something cold settle low in his stomach, a recognition that he had built an entire marriage out of neglect so consistent it had calcified into cruelty, even though he had never once intended cruelty at all. He found his sister, Lady Beatrice, in the breakfast room later that morning, and though she was several years his junior, she looked at him with the particular clarity of someone who had watched from the outside for years and had simply been waiting for him to finally ask the right question. "You have finally noticed," Beatrice said, not unkindly, setting down her teacup. "I wondered how long it would take." "You knew as well? Why did you say nothing?" "I tried, Nathaniel. More than once. You did not wish to hear it. Do you remember the Christmas gathering 3 years past, when I mentioned that Cordelia seemed unwell, and you told me she was simply tired from managing the household? She was not tired. She was lonely. There is a difference, though I understand now you could not see it." He sat across from her, his appetite gone entirely, the plate before him untouched. "What do I do now, Beatrice? She has already written to William. She means to leave within the fortnight." Beatrice studied him for a long moment before answering, her expression softening slightly, though her words remained firm. "You cannot undo 5 years in a single conversation, Nathaniel, however sincere. If you truly wish to keep her, you must show her, not tell her. Words have never been your difficulty. Attention has." He absorbed this in silence, turning it over, recognizing the truth of it even as it stung. He had always believed himself a devoted husband simply because he had never strayed, never spoken cruelly, never raised his voice within these walls. He was only now understanding that devotion required more than the absence of wrongdoing. It required presence, and presence was precisely what he had failed to give. Later that afternoon, he sought out Cordelia in the small library at the eastern end of the house, the room she had always favored, though he realized with a fresh jolt of shame that he could not recall the last time he had seen her there, or anywhere else in the house that was not the dining room during one of their rare, silent meals together. She sat near the window with a book open on her lap, though her eyes were fixed on the gardens beyond the glass rather than the page before her. "May I sit with you?" he asked, and the question felt strange in his mouth, formal and uncertain, a request he had never before thought necessary to make in his own home. She glanced up, surprised, though she did not refuse him. "If you wish." He took the chair across from her, close enough to speak without raising his voice, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. The silence between them had always felt comfortable to him before, a mark of a marriage that required no unnecessary noise. He understood now that it had never been comfortable to her. It had simply been the only option she had left. "I spoke with Mrs. Whitlow this morning," he said finally. "And with Beatrice. I have spent the entire day trying to understand how I became a man capable of overlooking you for 5 years, and I find I have no satisfying answer, only the plain fact that I did it, and that the fault is entirely mine." Cordelia closed her book slowly, marking her place with a slender ribbon, and regarded him with an expression he could not quite read, somewhere between wariness and cautious surprise. "You have never spoken to me this way before. I have never had cause to examine myself this closely before. I am not proud of what I have found." He leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped between his knees, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he allowed her to see uncertainty plainly on his face, rather than the careful composure he usually wore like armor. "I cannot ask you to unpack that trunk today, Cordelia. I have not earned that yet, and I understand if you no longer believe I ever will, but I am asking you to consider staying a little longer, not because I demand it as your husband, but because I am asking it as a man who has only just begun to understand what he stands to lose." She held his gaze for a long moment, searching his face the way she had searched it the previous evening, looking for the coldness that had defined so many years between them, and finding, instead, something unfamiliar and raw. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she turned her attention back to the window, to the gardens he had once refused to walk with her, now bathed in the soft gold light of late afternoon. "I have already written to William," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. "I do not know that I can simply unwrite it because you have had one difficult day of reflection. I am not asking you to unwrite anything today. I am only asking for time, a fortnight perhaps before you go, long enough for you to see whether anything has truly changed, rather than taking my word for it alone." She considered this for a long while, the silence stretching between them, though it no longer felt quite as empty as it once had. Finally she nodded, once, a small and cautious concession rather than a promise. "A fortnight then. But Nathaniel, I warn you now, I have believed in change before, in small ways, over small disappointments, and each time I convinced myself it meant more than it did. I will not make that mistake again simply because you have found your conscience after 5 years of silence." "I understand," he said, and meant it, though he understood too that understanding alone would not be enough. He would have to prove himself in ways he had never before bothered to attempt, through action rather than intention, through the slow accumulation of small, consistent things, rather than a single dramatic gesture meant to erase years of neglect in an afternoon. He rose from his chair, unwilling to overstay the fragile ground she had just granted him, and paused at the door before leaving her alone with her book and the golden light. "Might I join you for dinner this evening?" Something flickered across her face, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, cautious and unpracticed after so long unused. "I suppose that would be a reasonable place to begin." He left the library with something he had not felt in longer than he could remember, a fragile, uncertain hope, tempered heavily by the knowledge of exactly how much damage he had done, and exactly how little time he had been given to undo it. In the corridor he passed Pruitt, who offered a small, approving nod, the first such gesture the steward had given him in longer than Nathaniel cared to admit, and he understood, walking on toward his study, that even the servants had been watching his failures far more closely than he had ever bothered to watch himself. That evening, dinner was served in the smaller dining room rather than the grand hall the family used for entertaining guests, a choice Nathaniel had made deliberately. hoping the smaller space might feel less like a stage and more like the beginning of something honest. Cordelia arrived precisely on time, dressed simply, her expression guarded but not unkind, and took her seat across from him at a table that suddenly felt far too large for the two of them despite its modest size. For the first several minutes, neither of them spoke, and the old silence threatened to settle over the room once more, familiar and suffocating. It was Nathaniel who broke it, asking her, haltingly, about the book she had been reading in the library, a question so small it embarrassed him even as he asked it, knowing it was the sort of question a stranger might pose rather than a husband of 5 years. But Cordelia answered him anyway, describing the novel's plot with a quiet animation he had not seen in her in longer than he could recall, her hands moving slightly as she spoke, her eyes brightening despite herself. He listened, truly listened, in a way he realized with some shame he had rarely done before, and found himself asking follow-up questions not out of obligation, but out of genuine curiosity, wanting to understand the shape of her mind, the things that delighted her, the small observations she made about characters and their choices that revealed far more about his wife than 5 years of formal dinners ever had. By the time the second course arrived, the conversation had shifted naturally to her childhood in Bath, to memories of her father teaching her to sail small boats on the river, to the sound of her mother's laughter, which she said she still heard sometimes in quiet moments, though her mother had been gone for over a decade. "I did not know your mother had passed so young," Nathaniel said quietly, ashamed to admit it aloud. "You never spoke of her." "You never asked," Cordelia replied, though without malice, simply stating the fact, as she had learned to state so many things between them, plainly and without expectation of anything more. "I stopped offering these things after a while, Nathaniel. It became easier not to share what I knew would go unnoticed." The words landed heavily, though he had expected nothing less, and he nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of it rather than deflecting or defending himself as he might once have done. "I am asking now," he said simply. "I know it does not undo the years of silence, but I am asking now, and I intend to keep asking, if you will let me." She studied him across the table for a long moment, her fork resting untouched beside her plate, and something in her expression softened fractionally, though wariness remained close beneath the surface, as though she feared trusting this new version of him too quickly, only to watch him revert to the old distance the moment the fortnight ended. "One dinner does not undo 5 years, Nathaniel. I hope you understand that." "I do understand it. I do not expect it to. I only hope to earn a second dinner, and then perhaps a third, until the earning becomes its own kind of proof, rather than my words alone." They finished the meal in a conversation that grew steadily easier as it continued, though neither of them mistook it for a full repair of what had broken over so many years. When the final course was cleared, Nathaniel walked her to the base of the staircase, rather than retreating immediately to his study as had long been his habit, and bid her good night with a small, careful bow, resisting the urge to reach for her hand, understanding that such gestures had to be earned back slowly, one evening at a time, rather than claimed all at once through sheer force of sudden feeling. He did not yet know that his fortnight of grace would be tested sooner than he expected, or that a familiar face from Cordelia's own family would soon arrive at Harrogate, with intentions far less honest than his sudden, desperate repentance. The carriage arrived at Harrogate on the 4th day of the fortnight, its wheels cutting fresh lines through the gravel drive, and Cordelia recognized the crest on its door before the footman even lowered the step. Her cousin, Lord Edmund Faircastle, stepped down with the easy confidence of a man who had never once doubted his welcome anywhere, his coat immaculate, his smile already arranged for whatever audience awaited him. "Cordelia, my dear cousin." He crossed the drive with open arms, and she allowed him a brief embrace, though something in her chest tightened at his sudden appearance, unannounced and unexplained. "I heard the most troubling rumors in town, and simply could not stay away." "What rumors, Edmund?" "That all was not well between you and the Duke. Naturally, I came at once. Family looks after family, does it not?" She studied him carefully, searching for the sincerity she wanted to believe was there, though something in his eyes did not quite match the warmth of his words. Edmund had always possessed a talent for saying precisely what a person wished to hear, a skill that had served him well in London drawing rooms and gaming halls alike, though it had also left him with considerable debts that Cordelia suspected he hoped his family connections might eventually help resolve. "You need not have troubled yourself," she said carefully. "Whatever difficulties exist between myself and Nathaniel are being addressed." "Addressed?" Edmund's smile did not waver, though something flickered behind it. "That is a generous word for 5 years of neglect, is it not? Forgive me for speaking so plainly, cousin, But I have watched you shrink in this house for years, and I confess I had hoped, when word reached me of your planned departure, that you had finally found the courage to leave it behind entirely." Cordelia felt a flash of irritation at how easily he spoke of matters he understood only in fragments, gathered from whispers and gossip, rather than any true knowledge of what had passed between herself and her husband. "It is not so simple, Edmund. Nathaniel has begun to change. I owe it to myself, and perhaps to him, to see whether that change holds true." "Change." He repeated the word as though tasting something unpleasant. "Men like the Duke do not change, my dear. They perform contrition when it suits them, and return to their old habits the moment the performance has served its purpose. I have seen it a dozen times among my own acquaintances." She did not answer immediately, uncertain whether his warning came from genuine concern or something else entirely, though she pushed the suspicion aside as unkind, reminding herself that Edmund had always been dramatic in his opinions, prone to sweeping judgments delivered with theatrical certainty. She invited him inside for refreshment, if only to satisfy the demands of family courtesy, though she found herself watching him more closely than she once might have, alert to the careful way his gaze traveled over the house, cataloging its furnishings, its silver, its evident wealth. Over the following days, Edmund settled into Harrogate with the ease of a man who had decided to make himself indispensable. He walked with Cordelia in the gardens each morning, offering sympathetic commentary on every small slight she mentioned from years past, drawing out old grievances she had thought long buried, reframing Nathaniel's recent attentiveness as calculated rather than genuine. "Has it occurred to you," he said one morning, as they walked beneath the rose arbor, "that his sudden devotion began rather precisely at the moment he discovered your trunk was packed? Men do not change their hearts in a single afternoon, Cordelia. They change their strategy." "What strategy would he have to change, Edmund?" "I bring him no fortune beyond my own modest dowry. There is little for him to gain by keeping me here beyond simple companionship." Edmund hesitated, just slightly, a pause she might not have noticed had she not already grown wary of him. "Perhaps you underestimate what is at stake for him. I have heard, through certain circles in London, that the ducal accounts are soon to undergo review, related to matters left unresolved since his father's passing. A public separation, particularly one initiated by his own wife, would draw exactly the sort of scrutiny a man in his position could ill afford at such a delicate time." Cordelia said nothing for a long moment, turning this new information over carefully, though something about the way Edmund delivered it, too smoothly, too conveniently timed to unsettle the fragile trust she had begun rebuilding with Nathaniel, struck her as rehearsed rather than spontaneous. Still, doubt was a persistent thing once planted, and she found herself watching Nathaniel with new uncertainty over dinner that evening, searching his kindness for the seams of performance Edmund had suggested lay beneath it. Nathaniel noticed the shift immediately, though he could not name its source. Cordelia answered his questions more briefly than she had in recent days, offered fewer of the small, unguarded observations that had begun, tentatively, to color their conversations. He asked her directly whether something troubled her, and she deflected, citing tiredness, though the excuse rang hollow even to her own ears. It was Beatrice who first grew suspicious of Edmund's presence, watching him during a family gathering with the sharp, unsentimental attention she had always possessed. She noted the way his questions to the household staff seemed less like idle curiosity and more like careful inventory, asking Pruitt about the estate's recent expenditures, asking Mrs. Whitlow about the condition of the family's remaining silver, questions that had nothing to do with genuine concern for his cousin's happiness. "Something is not right about that man," Beatrice told her brother privately, cornering him in his study late one evening after Edmund had retired for the night. "He asks too many questions about matters of money, and too few about Cordelia's actual well-being. A man truly concerned for his cousin would ask after her heart, not after the household ledgers." "I have noticed it as well," Nathaniel admitted, setting down his pen, "but I cannot accuse him outright without evidence, not without risking exactly the appearance of jealousy and control that drove Cordelia away in the first place. I must tread carefully." "Then tread carefully, but tread quickly. I do not trust him, Nathaniel, and I trust my instincts on such matters more than I trust his smile." Nathaniel spent the following days observing his wife's cousin with quiet vigilance, noting the small inconsistencies in his stories, the way his account of his own finances shifted depending on his audience, boasting of investments to some, while quietly requesting small loans from others among the staff, always framed as temporary embarrassments soon to be resolved. He wrote discreetly to a solicitor in London, a man he trusted from his years managing the estate, requesting whatever information could be gathered regarding Lord Edmund Faircastle's current financial standing. Meanwhile, Cordelia found herself caught between two competing accounts of her own husband, one offered by Nathaniel himself through small, consistent acts of attention, walking with her each afternoon as he had once refused to do, remembering details of conversations from days before, arranging for her favorite flowers to be placed fresh in her chamber each morning, and another offered by Edmund, who continued, subtly and persistently, to cast doubt on every gesture, suggesting each kindness was calculated rather than sincere. She confided her confusion to Mrs. Whitlow one afternoon, finding the housekeeper arranging linens in the upstairs hall. "I do not know what to believe anymore," she admitted quietly. "Edmund suggests Nathaniel's attention is nothing more than strategy, meant to protect his reputation ahead of some review of the estate's accounts, and yet when I am with Nathaniel, none of it feels like strategy at all." Mrs. Whitlow paused in her work, considering her words carefully before speaking, as was her habit. "Forgive me for saying so plainly, Your Grace, but I have served this family for many years, long enough to recognize genuine change when I see it, and long enough to recognize a man with his own interests at heart when I see that as well. Lord Faircastle has asked me no fewer than 3 times this week about the value of the family silver. He has never once asked me how you have been sleeping, or whether you seem happier than when he arrived. I leave it to you to decide what that tells us about where his true concerns lie." The observation struck Cordelia with sudden force, and she realized, with some shame, how easily she had allowed Edmund's persistent doubts to color her perception of days that had, in truth, felt genuinely different from the 5 years that preceded them. She thought of Nathaniel's hand hovering uncertainly near hers in the library, his halting apology, the quiet, consistent presence he had offered her each evening since, none of which matched the calculated performance Edmund kept insisting lay beneath the surface. That evening she resolved to speak with Nathaniel directly, to lay Edmund's claims before him plainly rather than allowing suspicion to fester unspoken between them, as silence once had. She found him in his study, and though her sudden appearance clearly surprised him, he set aside his correspondence at once and gave her his full attention, exactly as he had promised to do. "Edmund tells me your finances are soon to face a formal review," she said, without preamble, watching his face carefully for any flicker of guilt or evasion. "He suggests your recent attentiveness toward me is meant to shield you from scrutiny during a public separation. Is there truth in this?" Nathaniel's expression shifted through surprise, then confusion, then something that looked distinctly like anger, though she noted it remained directed elsewhere, not toward her. "There is no review pending, Cordelia. The estate's accounts have been settled and clear since my father's passing, verified by the family solicitor only last spring. I do not know where your cousin obtained such information, but I assure you it bears no resemblance to the truth." She studied him a moment longer, searching for any sign of deception, and found none, only the same steady honesty that had characterized every conversation between them since the day she had begun packing her trunk. "I believed you," she said quietly. "I want you to know that, even as I asked the question. I believed you before you answered, and I find I am relieved to have that belief confirmed." "Why would he tell you such a thing?" Nathaniel asked, though even as he spoke the question, understanding began to dawn in his expression. The same suspicion Beatrice had voiced days before finally taking clearer shape in his own mind. "I do not know," Cordelia admitted, "but I intend to find out." The following morning, Nathaniel rode into the nearby town before breakfast, seeking out the local solicitor who managed correspondence between Harrogate and the family's man of business in London. He requested an urgent letter be sent, asking for any records concerning Lord Edmund Faircastle's recent financial dealings, his debts, his creditors, anything that might explain the strange fabrication about a pending review of the ducal accounts. The solicitor, a careful and discreet man named Mr. Halloway, promised a reply within the week, though he cautioned that matters of a gentleman's private debts were not always easily uncovered. Nathaniel returned to Harrogate in time for the midday meal, where he found Edmund holding court in the drawing room, entertaining Beatrice and 2 visiting neighbors with an elaborate story about a hunting expedition in Scotland that Nathaniel privately suspected had never occurred, given the man's evident unfamiliarity with even the most basic terms of the sport. He watched his wife's cousin with fresh scrutiny now, noting the way Edmund's attention shifted subtly whenever the conversation touched on money or property, the way his eyes lingered a beat too long on the silver tea service, the paintings along the drawing room walls, the general evident wealth of a house he seemed to be quietly appraising rather than simply visiting. That afternoon, Beatrice approached her brother in the corridor outside the library, her expression tight with barely contained urgency. "I spoke with one of the upstairs maids this morning," she said quietly. glancing over her shoulder to ensure they were not overheard. She tells me Lord Faircastle asked to see the household ledgers 3 days past, claiming he wished to help Cordelia understand the estate's finances now that she was considering her future. Pruitt refused him, of course, citing propriety, but the request itself troubles me greatly. It troubles me as well, Nathaniel admitted. I have written to Halloway in London, requesting whatever information can be gathered about Edmund's own debts. I suspect we shall not have long to wait before the truth reveals itself. He was correct, though the truth arrived sooner than even Halloway's promised week. 2 days later, a letter arrived from London, delivered by a rider who had clearly traveled through the night to ensure its swift arrival. Nathaniel read it alone in his study, his expression darkening with each line. The letter detailed considerable gambling debts accumulated by Lord Edmund Faircastle over the past 2 years, debts owed to several disreputable moneylenders in London who had grown increasingly impatient for repayment, along with a pattern of behavior among his acquaintances that suggested a man actively searching for a wealthy relation whose fortune might rescue him from his mounting obligations. More damning still, Halloway had included a brief note mentioning that Edmund had, only weeks earlier, made inquiries with a London solicitor regarding the legal process by which a woman separated from her husband might claim a portion of the marital estate, and whether such claims might be transferred or managed on her behalf by a trusted family member acting in her interest. Nathaniel sat with the letter for a long time, feeling something cold settle in his chest as the full shape of Edmund's scheme became clear. The man had not come to Harrogate out of concern for his cousin's happiness. He had come because he had heard rumors of a marriage in collapse and recognized, with the calculating instinct of a desperate gambler, an opportunity to position himself as Cordelia's protector, her advisor, perhaps eventually the manager of whatever settlement she might receive should the marriage truly end, all while quietly siphoning away whatever funds passed through his careful, sympathetic hands. He found Beatrice in the small sitting room and showed her the letter without a word. She read it twice, her expression growing darker with each pass, before finally setting it down on the table between them. "We must show this to Cordelia," she said, carefully, "and soon, before he does further damage to what little trust you have managed to rebuild." "I agree, though I worry how she will receive it. She has already grown wary of my every gesture because of the doubts he has planted. I fear presenting this evidence too bluntly may only appear as another attempt to control the narrative between us." "Then do not present it bluntly. Let her see the proof herself, in Halloway's own words, and draw her own conclusions. She is not a foolish woman, Nathaniel. She has simply been given every reason these past years to doubt the sincerity of the men around her. Give her the truth plainly, and trust her to recognize it." Nathaniel took his sister's counsel, and that evening, after dinner had concluded and Edmund had retired early citing fatigue from his supposed hunting adventures, Nathaniel sought Cordelia out in her private sitting room and laid the letter before her without preamble, explaining only its origin and the questions that had prompted him to seek it. Cordelia read the letter in silence, her face growing pale as she absorbed each detail: the gambling debts, the inquiries about marital settlements, the pattern of behavior that painted her cousin not as a concerned relation, but as a man circling a wounded family in search of opportunity. When she finished, she set the letter down with trembling hands and pressed her fingers briefly against her eyes, absorbing the full weight of how thoroughly she had nearly been deceived. "I defended him," she said quietly, more to herself than to Nathaniel. "I allowed his words to plant doubt in a trust I was only just beginning to rebuild, and all the while he was measuring the silver and inquiring after settlements." "You could not have known," Nathaniel said gently, resisting the urge to reach for her hand, though the desire to comfort her was strong. "He is skilled at what he does. I nearly missed it myself, and I have known men of his sort before. What do we do now?" "We confront him," Nathaniel said, his voice steady with a resolve that had been building since he first read Halloway's letter. "Together, if you are willing, so that he understands clearly that his scheme has failed and that this family sees him plainly for exactly what he is." Cordelia nodded slowly, her earlier uncertainty hardening into something firmer, something closer to the composure she had carried the day he found her packing her trunk. "Tomorrow, then. Let us end this before it goes any further." Neither of them yet realized how quickly that answer would arrive, or how thoroughly Edmund Faircastle's careful performance was about to unravel before the entire household. Edmund Faircastle came down to breakfast the next morning in high spirits, humming softly to himself as he filled his plate from the sideboard, entirely unaware that the letter sitting folded in Nathaniel's coat pocket had already dismantled every careful lie he had spent the past week constructing. He greeted Cordelia with his usual warmth, commenting on the fine weather, asking whether she had slept well, and she answered him with a composure that gave away nothing of what she now knew. "Edmund," Nathaniel said, once the servants had cleared the room at his quiet instruction, "I wonder if you might join us in the study before you continue your morning." Something flickered across Edmund's face, quick and barely perceptible, though Cordelia caught it, the first genuine crack in his practiced ease. "Of course, Your Grace. Is something troubling you?" "Several things, actually. I believe you may be able to help clarify them." They walked together to the study in a silence that felt increasingly heavy with each step, Edmund's earlier good humor visibly draining as they went, replaced by a wariness he tried and failed to fully conceal. Once inside, Nathaniel closed the door and gestured for Edmund to sit, though he himself remained standing, the letter now held plainly in his hand. "I received correspondence from London yesterday," Nathaniel said, "regarding certain debts you have accumulated over the past 2 years, and certain inquiries you made recently with a solicitor, concerning the legal process by which a separated wife might claim a portion of her husband's estate, and whether such claims might be managed by a trusted relation acting on her behalf." Edmund's composure faltered visibly now, his eyes darting briefly toward Cordelia, before returning to Nathaniel, searching for some avenue of denial or deflection. "I do not know what you have been told, but I assure you, whatever rumors have reached you have been grossly exaggerated. I came here only out of concern for my cousin." "Did you?" Cordelia said, speaking for the first time, her voice quiet but unwavering. "Then perhaps you can explain why you asked Pruitt to see the household ledgers, or why you have inquired no fewer than 3 times this week about the value of our silver, yet never once asked how I have been sleeping, or whether these past days have brought me any genuine happiness." Edmund's mouth opened, then closed, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, the silence stretching until it became its own kind of confession. Finally, he attempted a different approach, his voice taking on a wounded, injured quality. "You misunderstand me entirely, Cordelia. I only wish to ensure you would not be left destitute should this marriage truly end. Is that so unreasonable a concern for a cousin to hold?" "It would not be unreasonable," Nathaniel said evenly, "if it were true. But Holloway's letter makes clear that your debts to certain moneylenders in London have grown considerably urgent, and that you have spoken openly among your own acquaintances of your hope that a wealthy relation might soon rescue you from those obligations. I do not believe your concern for Cordelia's future has anything to do with her happiness, Edmund. I believe it has everything to do with your own desperation." The room fell into a heavy silence. Edmund's face had gone pale, the easy charm that had carried him through years of similar schemes finally failing him entirely, stripped away to reveal something smaller and more frightened beneath it. He looked to Cordelia once more, perhaps hoping for some lingering loyalty of blood to shield him, but found only cool, steady disappointment in her expression. "I trusted you," she said quietly. "You are family, Edmund. I welcomed you into this house at the very moment I felt most vulnerable, and you used that vulnerability to serve your own ends, sowing doubt between myself and my husband not out of concern for me, but because a marriage in ruins served your purposes far better than a marriage being carefully rebuilt. Cordelia, please, you must understand the position I have been placed in." "I understand it perfectly well," she interrupted, her voice firm now, any remaining softness toward him gone entirely. "You have gambled away your own fortune, and sought to gamble with mine as recompense. I will not pretend otherwise simply to spare your comfort." Nathaniel stepped forward, setting the letter down on the desk between them, his expression hard but controlled. "You will leave Harrogate today, Edmund. I will not have you continue under this roof pretending concern you do not feel, manipulating my wife's trust for your own gain. I could pursue this matter further, involve the proper authorities regarding your attempts to interfere in a private marital matter for financial advantage, but I will spare you that humiliation, provided you leave quietly and do not attempt to contact Cordelia again without her express invitation." Edmund's face cycled through several expressions in quick succession, indignation, then calculation, then finally something closer to defeat, as he recognized the futility of further argument. He rose from his chair slowly, gathering what remained of his dignity around him like a threadbare coat. "You will regret this, Nathaniel. Both of you will. Family should stand by family, whatever their difficulties. Family," Cordelia said quietly, "does not measure silver while pretending to measure grief. Goodbye, Edmund." He left the study without another word, and within 2 hours his carriage had departed Harrogate entirely, his trunk hastily packed by a footman under Pruitt's careful supervision, ensuring nothing of value had found its way among his belongings that did not rightfully belong to him. Cordelia watched the carriage disappear down the long drive from the window of the small library, feeling a complicated mixture of relief and lingering hurt at how easily she had nearly been deceived by someone she had trusted since childhood. Nathaniel found her there sometime later, the afternoon light slanting gold across the room exactly as it had the day he first sought her out after learning the truth of his own neglect. He did not speak immediately, simply took the chair across from her as he had before, allowing the silence between them to settle into something companionable rather than strained. "I am sorry," he said finally. "Not simply for Edmund, though I am sorry you were made to endure his deception. I am sorry that my own failures over these past years created exactly the wound he sought to exploit. Had I been a better husband from the beginning, he would have found no opening at all." Cordelia considered this for a long moment, turning her gaze back toward the gardens beyond the window. "Perhaps, though I think it unfair to lay the entire blame for his greed at your feet, Nathaniel. Edmund's choices were his own, made long before he ever arrived at our door. You cannot claim responsibility for every weakness in the people around me, however much guilt you seem determined to carry. I am trying to understand my own part in it clearly, without excusing it and without inflating it beyond what is fair. It is a difficult balance to strike, after years of neither examining myself at all." She almost smiled at that, the ghost of warmth returning to her expression more fully than it had in days. "You have managed the examination well enough these past 2 weeks, better certainly than I expected when I closed that trunk and thought myself finished with this house entirely. Do you still intend to close it again? To leave, once the fortnight ends?" She was quiet for a long moment, and he found himself holding his breath despite his best effort at composure, waiting for an answer he could not predict. "I do not know yet," she admitted finally, her honesty unflinching even now. "I know that these past days have shown me a man I did not believe still existed beneath the coldness I had grown so accustomed to. But 2 weeks cannot undo 5 years entirely, Nathaniel, however genuine your effort has been. I need more time before I am certain, and I think it only fair that you understand that plainly, rather than assuming Edmund's departure has settled everything between us." "I understand," he said, and though disappointment flickered briefly across his face, he did not argue the point, recognizing, perhaps for the first time in his life, that some things could not be rushed simply because he now wished them resolved. "Take whatever time you require. I will still be here, attempting to prove myself worthy of your trust, whether that proof takes a fortnight or a year." She studied him for a long moment, searching his face for the performance Edmund had insisted lay beneath his every gesture, and found instead only quiet, patient sincerity, unhurried and unclaiming. It was, she realized, precisely the kind of steadiness she had once hoped for in the earliest days of their marriage, before disappointment taught her to stop hoping at all. Whether it had arrived too late to matter remained, for now, an open question, one she was no longer certain she wished to answer with the same finality she had carried into this room a fortnight before. That evening Nathaniel dined alone with his own thoughts once Cordelia had retired early, exhausted by the weight of the morning's confrontation, and he found himself turning over her words with the same careful attention he had begun applying to every part of their fragile reconciliation. She had not refused him outright. She had not renewed her intention to leave within days as she once had. She had simply asked for time, honestly and without pretense, and he understood now that honesty, however uncomfortable, was worth more to their marriage than any amount of practiced charm Edmund had ever offered. He wrote a letter that night to Mr. Halloway, thanking him for his swift and thorough work, and requesting that the solicitor discreetly monitor any further attempts by Edmund Faircastle to approach the family, whether through correspondence, intermediaries, or renewed visits under some fresh pretense. He did not trust a man so thoroughly exposed to simply retreat without some final attempt at recovering what he had lost, and he intended to ensure Cordelia remained protected from any such effort, whatever form it eventually took. The following days settled into a rhythm gentler than any Harrogate had known in years. Nathaniel continued his morning walks with Cordelia through the gardens, no longer as a deliberate performance meant to prove himself, but because he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he genuinely looked forward to the hour each day, to the particular way she noticed small details in the roses that he had walked past 1,000 times without seeing, to the quiet observations she made about the household staff, their families, their small joys and worries, details he was only now learning to notice himself. Beatrice watched the change in her brother with a mixture of relief and cautious optimism, though she remained careful not to declare victory too soon, having watched enough of the household's history to understand that old habits could reassert themselves the moment vigilance relaxed. She spoke privately with Mrs. Whitlow one afternoon in the housekeeper's parlor. the two women comparing their observations with the practiced discretion of people who had spent years watching this family from close quarters. "He has not retreated to his study once this week before dinner," Mrs. Whitlow noted, folding a stack of linens with methodical care. "In 5 years, I do not believe I have seen such a thing. Even during the earliest months of the marriage, when he still made some effort, he never sustained it more than a fortnight before returning to his old patterns." "Then we shall simply have to watch whether this fortnight becomes a month, and the month becomes a habit," Beatrice replied. "I want to believe him changed entirely, but I have learned not to trust hope alone where my brother is concerned. Action sustained over time will tell us far more than any single gesture, however sincere it appears in the moment." Cordelia herself remained cautious, though she found the caution growing gradually lighter with each passing day, like a weight slowly set down rather than carried forever. She wrote to her brother in Bath, explaining that her departure would be delayed indefinitely while she determined whether the changes she had witnessed in her husband might prove lasting rather than temporary, and William's reply, when it arrived, offered gentle support without pressure in either direction, trusting his sister's judgment in a matter only she could properly weigh. She thought often of Edmund in those quiet days, not with anger exactly, though anger certainly remained, but with a kind of sorrowful bewilderment at how thoroughly she had misjudged a man she had known since childhood. She wondered whether his greed had always lain dormant beneath his charm, waiting only for sufficient desperation to bring it fully to the surface, or whether circumstance alone had corrupted a man who might once have been genuinely kind. She did not know, and she suspected she never fully would, but she found she no longer wished to spend her remaining days at Harrowgate, dwelling on his betrayal, when there was a more immediate question demanding her attention. The question of whether the husband seated across from her each evening truly represented a lasting change, or merely an extended performance she had not yet seen collapse. Beyond the walls of Harrowgate, unknown to either of them yet, word of Edmund's disgrace had already begun to travel through certain circles of London society, carried by his own bitter tongue as he sought sympathy among his remaining acquaintances, and with it traveled a distorted version of events that would soon reach the ears of the very peers whose judgment mattered most to a duke's reputation and standing. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, thick cream paper bearing the seal of Lord and Lady Ashbourne, longtime friends of the Harrowgate family, requesting the Duke and Duchess's presence at a gathering the following week, meant to celebrate the betrothal of their eldest daughter. Under ordinary circumstances, Cordelia would have accepted without a second thought, but Beatrice arrived at breakfast that morning with a folded newspaper tucked beneath her arm, and an expression that suggested the invitation carried complications neither of them yet understood. "You should see this before you decide anything," Beatrice said, setting the paper down beside Cordelia's plate, folded open to a page of society gossip written in the breathless, insinuating style such columns favored. Cordelia read it quickly, her stomach tightening with each line. The piece described, in carefully vague but unmistakable terms, whispers that the Duchess of Harrowgate had recently attempted to leave her husband, that a family scandal involving a disgraced cousin had erupted at the estate, and that the Duke's sudden, well-publicized devotion to his wife in recent weeks appeared, to certain observers, suspiciously convenient given rumors of an impending review into the ducal finances. "This is precisely the story Edmund threatened us with," Cordelia said quietly, setting the paper down with hands that had gone slightly unsteady. "He could not touch us directly, so he has chosen instead to poison our name in every drawing room in London." Nathaniel, who had entered midway through her reading, took up the paper himself, his jaw tightening as he absorbed the same words. "This will not simply fade on its own. Left unanswered, it will follow us to every gathering we attend for months, perhaps years, each fresh conversation adding new embellishments to whatever truth remains beneath it." "What would you have us do?" Cordelia asked. "Issue some formal denial? That would only lend the rumor more weight than it deserves, confirming to every reader that there was indeed something worth denying." Nathaniel considered this carefully, pacing the length of the breakfast room with the particular restless energy of a man working through a difficult problem. "A denial accomplishes little, you are right, but silence accomplishes even less. I believe the only answer that carries any real weight is to be seen together, plainly and without hesitation, before precisely the audience most likely to spread such rumors further. Let them witness for themselves whatever truth exists between us, rather than relying on second-hand whispers shaped by a bitter, desperate man." "You mean to attend the Ashbourne gathering after all?" "I mean for us to attend it together, and for me to make plain, before that gathering, precisely how I regard you, so thoroughly and so publicly that no remaining doubt can survive the evening." Cordelia studied her husband carefully, searching for any trace of the calculated performance Edmund had once accused him of, and found instead only steady resolve, the same quality that had characterized every gesture he had made toward her since the day she began packing her trunk. Still, the prospect of standing before London society while whispered rumors circulated about her marriage filled her with an anxiety she had not felt in years, and she said as much, admitting her fear plainly rather than concealing it as she once might have done. "I understand your fear," Nathaniel said gently, crossing the room to stand nearer to her, though he did not presume to reach for her hand without invitation, a habit of careful restraint he had maintained since the confrontation with Edmund. "I do not ask you to face it for my sake, or for the sake of my reputation alone, though I will not pretend the estate's standing carries no weight in this decision. I ask it because I believe, truly, that facing this together may prove far less painful than allowing the rumor to fester unanswered, growing larger and more distorted with each passing week we remain absent from society." She weighed his words for a long moment, glancing once more at the newspaper still lying open on the table, its careless insinuations already, she suspected, being repeated in a dozen breakfast rooms across London that very morning. "Very well," she said finally, "we shall attend together. But Nathaniel, I want it understood plainly between us that I will not perform contentment I do not feel, simply to satisfy the curiosity of people who have never once concerned themselves with my genuine happiness. Whatever we show them must be true, or I will have no part in it." "I would ask nothing less," he replied, and something in his voice carried such quiet conviction that she found herself believing him entirely. The Ashbourne gathering, when the evening finally arrived, filled the great hall of Ashbourne House with the particular glittering excess of London's most fashionable circles, chandeliers blazing overhead, musicians arranged in one corner playing something bright and formal, the assembled guests moving through careful patterns of conversation, designed as much for observation as for genuine exchange. Cordelia felt the weight of curious glances the moment she and Nathaniel entered together, whispers passing behind gloved hands, eyes tracking their every movement with barely concealed interest. Nathaniel did not release her arm as they moved through the crowd, nor did he retreat, as he might once have done, into conversations with other gentlemen that excluded her entirely. He introduced her to acquaintances she had never met despite years of marriage, spoke of her opinions and interests with evident pride rather than the polite indifference that had once characterized his public manner toward her. And gradually, as the evening progressed, Cordelia found her initial anxiety softening into something closer to genuine ease, buoyed by a husband who seemed determined to prove, before every witness present, that whatever rumors circulated bore no resemblance to the truth of their marriage. It was during a lull in the music as guests gathered near the refreshment tables in loose clusters of conversation that Lord Pemberton, an older gentleman known throughout society for his blunt manner and evident enjoyment of stirring difficult conversations into public view, approached the Duke and Duchess with a smile that did not entirely reach his eyes. "Your Grace," he said, addressing Nathaniel with exaggerated formality, "I confess, I have heard the most curious rumors this past fortnight, concerning certain difficulties within your household. I do hope all is well between yourself and the Duchess." A hush fell over the nearby cluster of guests, conversations pausing mid-sentence as attention shifted toward the exchange, and Cordelia felt her chest tighten with the old familiar instinct to shrink from public scrutiny, to deflect and minimize, as she had learned to do throughout years of quiet unhappiness. But Nathaniel did not hesitate, did not offer the careful, evasive non-answer such moments typically demanded. "I thank you for your concern, Lord Pemberton, though I confess it is unwarranted." His voice carried clearly across the hushed cluster of guests, steady and unhurried, the voice of a man entirely certain of what he intended to say. "If rumors have reached you suggesting difficulty within my marriage, I would ask you to consider their source carefully, for I can assure you, before every person gathered here this evening, that my wife is the truest measure of worth I have encountered in my life, and any distance that may once have existed between us was born entirely of my own failures I have spent recent weeks working diligently to correct. She is not merely the Duchess of Harrogate by title, she is its true mistress, in every sense that matters, and I count myself fortunate beyond measure that she has permitted me the chance to prove it." The words rang through the hall with unmistakable clarity, and Cordelia felt her breath catch, unprepared for the sheer public totality of his declaration, so thoroughly unlike the careful private reticence that had defined their marriage for 5 long years. Lord Pemberton, for his part, looked momentarily taken aback by the directness of the response, clearly having expected a more guarded deflection rather than such unflinching honesty delivered before a room full of witnesses. "Well," Pemberton said finally, recovering his composure with a small approving nod. "That is plainly and admirably said, Your Grace." "I confess I did not expect quite so direct an answer." "I have grown tired of indirection," Nathaniel replied. "It has cost me a great deal, and I do not intend to practice it any longer, particularly where my wife's honor is concerned." The cluster of guests around them began to murmur, though the tone had shifted noticeably from curious speculation to something closer to admiration, and Cordelia felt Beatrice's hand find hers briefly from somewhere in the crowd, a small, silent gesture of solidarity and pride. Across the room she noticed several of the evening's most persistent gossips exchanging glances that suggested the story they would carry forward from tonight bore little resemblance to the version they had arrived expecting to witness. Later, as their carriage carried them home through the darkened London streets, Cordelia sat quietly beside her husband, turning the evening over in her mind, still faintly astonished by the public certainty of his declaration. "You did not have to say quite so much," she said finally. "A simple denial would have satisfied the moment." "A simple denial would have been a lie," Nathaniel replied, his gaze steady on her in the dim carriage light. "Everything I said tonight was true, Cordelia, every word of it, and I found I did not wish to offer you anything less than the full truth before that room, regardless of how it might be received." She studied him for a long moment, the candlelight from the carriage lamp casting soft shadows across his face, and felt something settle within her that had remained unsettled since the morning she first closed her trunk, weeks ago now, though it felt at once both longer and shorter than that. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for tonight, and for these past weeks. I do not know that I have properly said so until now, but I see the effort you have made, Nathaniel, plainly and consistently, and I no longer believe it to be a performance." "What do you believe it to be, then?" She considered the question carefully before answering, wanting her words to carry the same honesty he had shown her throughout the evening. "I believe it to be a man finally choosing to become the husband he might have been from the beginning, had he only understood sooner what stood to be lost through neglect. Whether that is enough to undo 5 years entirely, I still cannot say with certainty, but it is, I think, enough to make me glad I did not leave when I first intended." Nathaniel reached for her hand then, slowly, giving her every opportunity to withdraw it, and when she did not, he held it gently for the remainder of the ride home, neither of them speaking further, the silence between them finally, after so many years, feeling like comfort rather than absence. News of Nathaniel's public declaration spread through London society far more quickly than Edmund's original whispers had managed, carried this time by guests who had witnessed the exchange firsthand and found themselves genuinely moved by its sincerity, rather than merely entertained by scandal. Within days, the tenor of conversation surrounding the Harrogate marriage had shifted entirely, from cautious speculation about a fractured household to something closer to admiration for a duke who had spoken so plainly and publicly in defense of his wife. Lady Ashbourne herself called on Cordelia the following week, ostensibly to discuss arrangements for her daughter's upcoming wedding, though the true purpose of the visit soon became clear, as she gently steered the conversation toward the events of her own gathering. "I do not believe I have witnessed anything quite so moving in a London drawing room in a great many years," she confided, settling into the chair Cordelia offered her in the small library. "Lord Pemberton has spoken of little else since, and I confess even my own husband remarked upon it with unusual sincerity. Whatever difficulties you and the Duke may have faced, my dear, it is plain to everyone who witnessed that evening that they have been met with genuine resolve rather than mere appearance." Cordelia accepted the compliment with careful grace, though she found herself faintly astonished at how thoroughly a single evening had reshaped the narrative surrounding her marriage, transforming whispered scandal into something closer to a story of redemption, discussed now with warmth rather than derision. She understood, of course, that society's good opinion mattered little compared to the private truth of her own feelings, but she could not deny the relief of no longer bracing herself against curious, pitying glances each time she ventured beyond the walls of Harrogate. Word of the shifting narrative eventually reached even William in Bath, who wrote to his sister with evident relief, expressing gladness that whatever troubles had prompted her earlier letter now seemed to be resolving in a direction she found genuinely hopeful. Cordelia read his letter twice, noting the careful, brotherly concern woven through every line, and found herself grateful, not for the first time, that she had a family beyond Harrogate who cared for her well-being without any agenda beyond her own happiness, a contrast that made Edmund's betrayal sting all the more sharply in retrospect. Beatrice, ever practical, cautioned her sister-in-law gently against placing too much weight on society's fickle approval, however welcome the shift in opinion might feel after weeks of quiet dread. London forgets as quickly as it remembers, she said one afternoon, as the two women walked together through the gardens Cordelia had once walked alone. What matters far more than Lord Pemberton's approval or Lady Ashbourne's kind words is what continues to happen within these walls, once the excitement of a single evening has faded from memory. I have watched my brother closely these past weeks, Cordelia, and I believe the change in him is genuine, but genuine change must be sustained through the quiet, unremarkable days as much as through a single dramatic evening in a crowded ballroom. I understand that well, Cordelia replied, perhaps better than anyone, having spent 5 years learning precisely how easily a marriage can hollow out beneath the appearance of ordinary contentment. I do not intend to mistake one evening for a complete resolution. But I confess it has given me something I had not expected to feel again so soon, a genuine hope that the man beside me at that gathering was not performing for an audience, but speaking a truth he had simply never before found the courage or the occasion to voice. As the weeks following the Ashbourne gathering unfolded, Nathaniel continued the quiet, consistent attentions that had begun even before Edmund's scheme had fully unraveled, though Cordelia noticed now a new ease in his manner, as though the public declaration had freed something within him that years of careful reserve had long kept tightly bound. He spoke more openly of his own childhood, of the distant, formal father who had raised him to believe that affection displayed too plainly was a weakness unbecoming a future duke, a lesson Nathaniel confessed, with evident regret, he had absorbed far too thoroughly into his own conduct as a husband. I did not understand until recently how completely I had inherited his coldness, he admitted to her one evening, as they sat together in the small library that had become, in recent weeks, their most frequent refuge from the demands of the wider household. I told myself I was simply a private man, reserved by temperament rather than choice, and I never once questioned whether that reserve was costing you something I could not easily measure, until I very nearly lost you entirely. Cordelia listened to these admissions with a growing tenderness she had not expected to feel again so readily after so many years of guarded distance, though she remained careful, even now, not to let hope outpace the evidence of sustained change still unfolding before her. She had believed in small promises before, she reminded herself gently, and each time those promises had eventually dissolved back into the familiar silence she had grown to expect. But the weeks continued to accumulate steadily behind them now, each day adding to a pattern that looked increasingly less like performance, and increasingly more like the quiet, ordinary substance of a genuine marriage, finally being built, however belatedly, upon its true foundation. Autumn had settled fully over Harrowgate by the time Cordelia found herself standing once more before her trunk, though this time she stood in front of it not with the intention of filling it, but with a quiet, private curiosity about what remained inside, untouched since the morning weeks ago when panic had first crossed her husband's face and changed the course of everything that followed. She had not spoken of the trunk since that day, had allowed it to sit closed in the corner of her dressing room, like a question neither of them had yet found reason to answer definitively. But this morning, with the first cold light of autumn slanting through her window and the gardens beyond turning gold and amber in their seasonal decline, she found herself drawn to it at last, ready to settle, privately and for herself alone, what she truly intended to do. She knelt before it and lifted the lid, finding everything exactly as she had packed it that first frantic morning. Her mother's shawl folded neatly atop the gowns, the small wooden box of jewelry tucked carefully to one side. She lifted the shawl free and pressed it briefly to her face, breathing in the faint, familiar scent that still clung to its fibers after all these years, a scent she associated with comfort, with home, with a version of herself that had existed before disappointment taught her to expect so little from the people meant to love her most. She thought of the woman who had packed this trunk, exhausted and resolved, certain that leaving was the only path left available to her. She thought of the weeks since, the slow, careful rebuilding, the public declaration at the Ashbourne gathering, the countless small gestures accumulated day after day, each one insignificant alone but together forming something she had genuinely begun to trust. She thought too of Edmund, and the sharp lesson his betrayal had taught her about the difference between performed concern and genuine care, a lesson that had, strangely, made her better equipped to recognize the authenticity of what Nathaniel now offered. A soft knock came at her door, and she knew without asking who stood on the other side, having learned, over these recent weeks, to recognize the particular rhythm of his footsteps in the corridor. "Come in," she called, and Nathaniel entered, pausing when he saw her kneeling beside the open trunk, her mother's shawl still held gently in her hands. "I did not mean to interrupt," he said, though he made no move to leave, his eyes drawn to the trunk with an expression she could not quite read, some mixture of old fear and cautious hope. "You are not interrupting." She looked up at him, studying his face in the soft morning light, searching, as she had so many times these past weeks, for any trace of the distant coldness that had once defined him, and finding, as she increasingly did now, only quiet, steady presence. "I was simply deciding what to do with all of this." He crossed the room slowly and knelt beside her, close enough that she could see the faint apprehension in his eyes, though he did not press her, did not ask outright what conclusion she had reached, allowing her instead the space to arrive at her own answer in her own time, exactly as he had promised weeks before. It was, she thought, precisely the kind of restraint he would never have shown in the earlier years of their marriage, when his silence had come not from patience but from simple inattention. "Do you remember," she said quietly, running her fingers over the worn leather edge of the trunk, "the morning you found me packing this? You looked at me as though the ground beneath you had opened entirely without warning. I remember it clearly. I do not believe I have ever felt fear quite so completely as I did in that moment, watching you fold your belongings with such calm certainty, understanding all at once that I had allowed the person I valued most in this world to become a stranger within my own house. I did not believe that morning that anything could change my mind. I had spent so many years convincing myself that hope was simply another disappointment waiting to happen, and I had grown tired of extending it toward you, only to watch it wither each time." She paused, folding the shawl carefully and setting it aside on the floor beside her. "But these past weeks have shown me something I did not expect to see again, Nathaniel. Not merely words, though you have offered those more generously than I ever thought you capable of. Actions, sustained, day after day, through moments both easy and difficult, through Edmund's betrayal and through that room full of watching eyes at the Ashbourne gathering. You have not once faltered back into the distance I had grown to expect." "I do not intend to falter," he said, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable undercurrent of hope he no longer bothered to conceal. "I understand now what such faltering costs, Cordelia, and I have no wish to pay that price again, nor to ask you to pay it alongside me." She reached into the trunk and, one by one, began lifting the folded gowns free, setting them aside not with the frantic urgency of that first morning, but with a slow, deliberate calm, as though each garment removed represented a small, quiet decision, renewed rather than a single dramatic reversal. Nathaniel watched her in silence, understanding, perhaps for the first time fully, the significance of what she was doing without requiring her to explain it aloud. "I am unpacking this trunk," she said finally, looking up at him with an expression that held both vulnerability and quiet resolve in equal measure. "Not because you have asked me to, and not because society now speaks kindly of our marriage, rather than whispering rumors behind their hands. I am unpacking it because I have watched you closely these past weeks, and I have come to believe, genuinely and for myself, that the man kneeling beside me now intends to remain the man he has shown himself to be these recent weeks, rather than reverting to the husband who once forgot my birthdays and answered my grief a week late." Nathaniel's composure broke slightly at her words, something raw and grateful crossing his features that he did not attempt to hide from her. "Not this time. Thank you," he said quietly, "for allowing me the chance to prove it, even when I gave you every reason over 5 years to believe such proof impossible." They finished unpacking the trunk together in a silence that felt, at last, entirely free of the old strain that had once characterized every quiet moment between them, replaced instead by something warmer, something that had been slowly, carefully rebuilt over the course of a single transformative fortnight and the weeks that followed it. When the final gown had been returned to its place in her wardrobe and the small wooden box of jewelry set back upon her writing desk, Nathaniel rose and extended his hand toward her, an invitation rather than a demand, exactly as every gesture between them had become in recent weeks. "Will you walk with me in the gardens?" he asked. "Not because I fear losing you should I fail to ask, but simply because I find I genuinely wish for your company this morning, as I have found myself wishing every morning since you first agreed to stay." Cordelia took his offered hand and rose to stand beside him, feeling the warmth of his grip, steady and sure, so unlike the distant formality that had once characterized every touch between them in the earliest years of their marriage. "I would like that very much," she said, and meant it entirely. They walked together through the gardens that morning, the same gardens he had once refused to walk with her, now blazing with the deep golds and reds of full autumn, the roses long since faded but replaced by the quieter, equally beautiful colors of the season's turning. He spoke to her of small matters, the estate's harvest, a letter he had received from an old friend in the north, his own tentative hope for the coming winter, and she found herself sharing in return, easily now, without the careful guardedness that had once governed every word she offered him. confident at last that her thoughts would be received with genuine attention, rather than polite, distracted indifference. They paused beneath the same rose arbor where Edmund had once planted his careful seeds of doubt, and Cordelia found she could stand there now without any lingering shadow of that betrayal, the space having been reclaimed entirely by weeks of genuine, unhurried conversation between herself and her husband. Nathaniel stopped walking and turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his expression carrying a sincerity she had once believed lost to him entirely. "I do not know how to promise you that I will never fail you again, Cordelia," he said quietly. "I know myself well enough now to understand that perfection is not something I can offer, however genuinely I intend to try. But I can promise you that I will never again allow my failures to pass unnoticed and unaddressed, that I will ask you, always, how you are truly faring, and that I will listen fully to whatever answer you give me, rather than allowing my own concerns to crowd out the space you deserve in this marriage and in this life." "That is enough," she said softly, her eyes bright with feeling she no longer bothered to conceal. "I do not ask for perfection, Nathaniel. I ask only for what you have given me these past weeks: honest, sustained attention, offered not as performance but as genuine choice, renewed each day, rather than assumed permanent from a single grand gesture. If you can continue offering me that, I find I want nothing more." He drew her gently closer, and for a long moment they simply stood together beneath the arbor, the golden autumn light filtering through the last remaining leaves overhead, the quiet of the garden settling around them not as the old, lonely silence she had once endured, but as something entirely different now, a shared stillness, born of genuine understanding rather than careful avoidance. In the weeks and months that followed, Harrogate slowly transformed into a household neither of them would have recognized a year before. Its halls filled increasingly with warmth rather than careful formal distance, its dinners shared rather than endured separately, its gardens walked together each morning as a matter of simple, genuine habit rather than deliberate proof. Word occasionally reached them of Edmund, settled now in some distant corner of the country, his debts eventually forcing him into a quieter life, far removed from London's fashionable circles, though neither Cordelia nor Nathaniel spent much time dwelling on his fate, their attention increasingly consumed by the far more important work of building, day by patient day, the marriage they had so nearly lost entirely. Mrs. Whitlow noticed the change most plainly of all, having served the household long enough to measure its moods against decades of quiet observation. She mentioned it to Pruitt one evening as the two of them shared a pot of tea in the servants' hall after the household had settled for the night, remarking that she had not heard the Duchess laugh so freely in all her years at Harrogate, nor seen the Duke linger so willingly outside his study once the day's business had concluded. "I confess I doubted it would last," Pruitt admitted, stirring his tea thoughtfully. "I have seen gentlemen make grand gestures before, in other households, only to watch them fade back into old habits once the excitement had passed. But it has been months now, Mrs. Whitlow, and if anything, His Grace seems only to grow more attentive with each passing week, not less. I believe it is because he finally understands what very nearly slipped through his fingers," Mrs. Whitlow replied. "Some men require the shock of near loss before they can truly see what stands before them. It is not the kindest way to learn such a lesson, but I have come to believe it is, for some men, the only way." Beatrice, too, found herself gradually setting aside the careful vigilance she had maintained through the earliest weeks of her brother's transformation, though she remained, by nature, too practical a woman to abandon all caution entirely. She watched instead with quiet satisfaction as the household around her continued to soften month by month, as Cordelia's laughter grew more frequent in the halls, as Nathaniel began, tentatively at first and then with growing confidence, to speak of matters he had once kept carefully guarded even from his own sister, his uncertainties about the estate, his private hopes for the family's future, the small daily worries that a man secure in his marriage no longer felt the need to carry entirely alone. Winter arrived at Harrogate not long after, blanketing the gardens in a fine layer of frost that transformed the rose arbor into something quiet and crystalline, and Cordelia found herself, on the first truly cold morning of the season, standing once more at her chamber window, though this time her gaze carried none of the restless longing that had once accompanied such mornings. She watched the frost settle over the grounds below and felt, for the first time in longer than she could properly measure, a genuine sense of belonging to this house, to this life, not as a duty quietly endured, but as a home actively chosen, day after day, by two people who had very nearly let it slip away entirely. Nathaniel found her there, as he so often did now, and joined her at the window without a word, his hand finding hers easily, naturally, the gesture requiring no hesitation or careful permission as it once might have. Together they watched the frost catch the pale winter light, turning the gardens into something briefly, quietly beautiful. And Cordelia thought, not for the first time, that she had come remarkably close to never witnessing mornings such as this one. Close to boarding a carriage bound for Bath and never looking back at a house that had, for so long, offered her nothing but silence in return for her devotion. She did not regret the woman who had packed that trunk in cold, determined resolve. That woman had been necessary, had done what needed doing to finally force a reckoning 5 years of quiet suffering could never have achieved on its own. But she was grateful, deeply and endlessly, that the story had not ended there, that a panicked husband's sudden fear had opened a door neither of them had believed still existed, and that behind that door had waited not merely reconciliation, but something far more valuable, a marriage rebuilt from its very foundation, sustained now not by obligation or habit, but by daily, deliberate choice. Cordelia thought sometimes of that first frantic morning, the trunk half packed, the letter to William already sealed and waiting, and found she felt no regret for the resolve that had nearly carried her away from Harrogate forever. That resolve, she understood now, had been necessary, the only force strong enough to finally break through 5 years of quiet neglect and force the reckoning that followed. She had not been wrong to pack that trunk. She had simply been fortunate enough to be given, at the very last possible moment, a genuine reason to unpack it again, and she intended to hold that reason close, cherished and protected, for whatever years remained ahead of them both. Spring returned to Harrogate the following year with a suddenness that caught the entire household by surprise, the gardens bursting into color almost overnight after a winter that had felt, to Cordelia, both long and remarkably peaceful in equal measure. She stood at the edge of the rose beds one morning, watching the first buds unfurl along branches that had seemed entirely bare only days before, and felt a quiet contentment settle over her that she had once believed permanently beyond her reach. Nathaniel joined her there, as he did most mornings now, though on this particular day he carried with him a folded letter she recognized immediately as bearing William's familiar hand. "Your brother writes that he intends to visit next month," he said, passing it to her, "along with news I believe will please you greatly." She opened the letter and read quickly, her eyes brightening as she absorbed William's careful, affectionate account of his own recent engagement to a young woman he had met the previous autumn, a schoolteacher from a modest but respectable family whom he described with such evident warmth that Cordelia found herself laughing aloud at her brother's uncharacteristic eloquence on matters of the heart. "He sounds thoroughly besotted," she said, refolding the letter with evident delight. "I confess I never expected William to speak of anyone in such glowing terms. He has always been far too practical for grand romantic declarations." "Perhaps love makes fools of even the most practical among us," Nathaniel said, with a small, knowing smile that carried none of the old formality that had once characterized every exchange between them. "I certainly never expected to find myself walking these gardens each morning, simply for the pleasure of my wife's company, and yet here I stand." Cordelia looked up at him, still faintly amazed, even after all these months, at how thoroughly the distance between them had dissolved, replaced by an ease so complete it sometimes felt to her as though the cold, silent years of their early marriage had belonged to entirely different people. "I look forward to meeting her," she said. "William's happiness has always mattered a great deal to me, particularly given how uncertain my own seemed not so very long ago." "You have every reason to celebrate happiness now," Nathaniel replied, "your own included." They walked on together through the gardens, and Cordelia found her thoughts drifting, as they occasionally still did, back to that frantic morning nearly a year past, the trunk half packed, the desperate calm that had carried her through those final preparations before her husband's sudden appearance changed the course of everything that followed. She no longer felt the sharp ache that memory had once carried, transformed instead into something closer to quiet gratitude, a reminder of how far they had traveled together since that single, pivotal moment of panic and reckoning. The household, too, had settled into a rhythm neither of them could have imagined a year before. Mrs. Whitlow continued to run Harrogate with her usual careful efficiency, though she moved now through halls that echoed with far more warmth than they once had. The Duke and Duchess frequently found together in the small library or walking the grounds, their laughter carrying occasionally through open windows in a manner that had once seemed entirely foreign to the house's careful, formal silence. Pruitt, for his part, had grown noticeably less guarded in his own manner, having watched the transformation of his employer's marriage, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had feared, at one point, that his long years of service might end amid scandal and separation, rather than the genuine contentment he now witnessed daily. Beatrice had married the previous autumn, a match born of genuine affection with a viscount from a neighboring county, and though she now maintained her own household some distance from Harrogate, she wrote to Cordelia frequently, their friendship having deepened considerably through the shared trial of Edmund's betrayal and its aftermath. In her most recent letter, she had teased her brother gently for having become, in her words, entirely insufferable in his devotion, though the teasing carried unmistakable warmth beneath its surface, the pride of a sister who had watched her brother finally become the man she had always hoped he might be. Word of Edmund reached them only rarely now, carried occasionally through distant acquaintances who mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he had settled into a quiet, diminished life in some corner of the country, far removed from London's fashionable circles, his debts having eventually caught up with him, despite his best efforts at evasion. Cordelia found she felt little beyond a faint, distant sadness when such news reached her. Sadness not for the loss of any relationship worth preserving, but for the waste of a man who might have chosen honesty and genuine connection over greed, had he only possessed the character to do so. On a warm afternoon in early summer, as the roses reached their fullest bloom along the arbor where Edmund had once planted his careful seeds of doubt, Nathaniel found Cordelia seated on the garden bench they had claimed, over the past year, as particularly their own, a book resting unopened in her lap, as she simply enjoyed the warmth of the sun and the quiet hum of bees moving among the flowers. "You are not reading," he observed, settling beside her. "I find I do not always need to be occupied to be content," she replied, leaning her head briefly against his shoulder, a gesture that would have seemed impossibly foreign between them only a year before, and now felt as natural as breathing. "There was a time when stillness frightened me, Nathaniel, because it so often meant loneliness. I am glad to have learned since that stillness can also simply mean peace." He wrapped his arm around her, drawing her closer against him, and for a long while neither of them spoke, content simply to sit together beneath the warm summer sun, surrounded by gardens that had once represented, to Cordelia, everything unreachable and distant about her marriage, and now represented instead everything she had nearly lost and been given, against all expectation, the chance to reclaim. "I think often," Nathaniel said eventually, his voice quiet and reflective, "about how close I came to losing you entirely, and how little I understood, in all the years before that morning, what I stood to lose. I do not know that I will ever stop being grateful for the chance you gave me to prove myself worthy of staying in your life." "You have more than proven it," Cordelia said softly, turning to meet his eyes with a warmth that carried none of the old caution she had once guarded so carefully. "Every day since has been its own proof, Nathaniel, sustained and genuine, exactly as you promised it would be. I do not measure you now against the man who once forgot my birthdays and answered my grief a week late. I measure you only against the man beside me now, and I find I have no complaints left to voice." He kissed her then, gently, in the golden afternoon light, surrounded by the roses that had witnessed both the beginning of their reconciliation and its steady, patient flourishing in the months since, and Cordelia felt, in that quiet moment, a completeness she had once believed entirely beyond her reach, a marriage rebuilt not through grand gestures alone but through the slow, deliberate accumulation of countless small choices, each one a quiet renewal of the promise he had made beneath this very arbor nearly a year before. That evening, William arrived earlier than expected, his carriage rolling up the long drive just as the household was preparing for dinner, and beside him sat the young woman Cordelia had heard so much about in his letters, a bright, warm-faced woman named Margaret who greeted the Duchess with none of the nervous formality Cordelia might have expected from a schoolteacher meeting a Duke and Duchess for the first time. Instead, she spoke easily, asking genuine questions about the gardens and the house's long history, and Cordelia found herself liking her brother's intended almost immediately, recognizing in her the same quiet, unaffected sincerity that had drawn William to her in the first place. Over dinner, William watched his sister with evident relief, comparing, Cordelia suspected, the woman seated across the table now with the version of her he had received letters from nearly a year before, letters that had carried far more sorrow than she had ever fully admitted even to herself at the time. "You look well, Cordelia," he said quietly, during a lull in the broader conversation. "Truly well. In a way your letters from last spring never quite managed to convince me of, however much you tried to reassure me otherwise." "I am well," she said simply, glancing across the table at Nathaniel, who caught her gaze and held it with the same warmth that had become so effortless between them now. "I very nearly was not, William. I want you to know that, now that enough time has passed for me to speak of it plainly rather than merely alluding to difficulties I could not yet fully name in my letters, but I am well now, genuinely, and I do not believe I have ever been more certain of anything in my life." William reached across the table and pressed her hand briefly, a small, wordless gesture of brotherly relief and affection, before the conversation moved naturally on to lighter matters. Margaret's own family in the countryside, the wedding they hoped to hold before the year's end, the small, ordinary joys of two families gradually becoming intertwined through genuine affection rather than mere obligation. Nathaniel listened with evident interest, asking Margaret thoughtful questions about her work as a teacher, questions Cordelia noted with quiet pride, understanding how thoroughly her husband had grown into a man capable of genuine curiosity about the lives of others, rather than the distracted indifference that had once defined him. Later that night, after their guests had retired and the house had settled into its familiar evening quiet, Cordelia and Nathaniel walked once more through the gardens beneath a sky scattered with early summer stars, the roses releasing their fragrance into the cool night air around them. She thought of the year behind them, of everything nearly lost and everything patiently, deliberately rebuilt, and felt no need to speak of it further, the comfortable silence between them now carrying none of the old ache it once had, filled instead with the quiet, settled contentment of two people who had chosen each other, fully and repeatedly, long after the choosing had ceased to be a matter of desperate necessity, and become instead a matter of genuine, unhurried joy. The trunk that had once sat packed and ready in the corner of her dressing room now held nothing but ordinary linens, its original purpose forgotten entirely except as a private memory the two of them occasionally revisited, with a mixture of tenderness and quiet disbelief at how close they had come to an entirely different ending. Cordelia sometimes thought that every marriage carried, somewhere within it, a hidden trunk of its own, a threshold moment where love either withered entirely or found, against considerable odds, the strength to begin again. She was endlessly grateful that hers had chosen the latter path, and she intended to spend whatever years remained ahead of her honoring that choice, one quiet, deliberate morning at a time, walking gardens that had finally, truly, become her own.